好，我们现在继续讲这个今天早上讲的这个课程的内容。
So we're going to continue with what we were talking about in this morning session.
那么上午呢，我们讲了这个，如果我们能够就是有一个不同的角度去思考问题的话，那我们的很多的心结其实是很容易打开的。
So what we were talking about this morning is that if it is possible, if we can manage to adopt a different perspective to approach or think about problems, then actually it's very easy for us to dissolve the many knots in our minds.
我们内心当中的种种的心结，通过药物来打开这个是非常不理想的，也是不会很成功的。
If we use medicine or pharmaceuticals to dissolve the various knots in our minds, this is really not the ideal approach to take, and it's probably not likely either that we will achieve success through this method.
所以我们的心结都是用我们的心自己去打开，这个就是最好的方法。
The best approach is to use the mind itself to untie its own knots.
好，这样子的话，我们首先了解一下，比如说愤怒的时候就是因为有什么样的原因让我们愤怒。
So the first thing that we need to understand is what has led to us feeling angry.
当然这个客观的因素呢，当然是有很多很多，这个我们是说不完的。
Of course, the various possible objective causes for our anger are so many, it wouldn't be possible to ever cover them all.
但是有主要的3个原因让我们愤怒。
In general, though, we can say that there are 3 main reasons that cause anger.
不仅是愤怒还有其他的，比如说欲望傲慢嫉妒等等这些所有的烦恼，也就是因为这3个原因。
And it's not just in respect of anger that we speak of these 3 main reasons. Also, these reasons pertain to desire, pride, jealousy, and all manner of afflictions.
第一个原因呢，就是因为我们现在都是普通的人用佛教的话讲的话叫做凡夫，就是普通的人。那么我们所有的普通人的内心当中就有各种各样的这个烦恼的种子。
The first reason for the afflictions that arise in our mind is the fact that we are all ordinary people. In Buddhist language, we are ordinary mortals, and as such, in our minds there are the seeds for all kinds of afflictions.
那么这些种子呢它就是一种潜在的能量比如说当我们特别特别开心的时候一点都没有生气，一点都没有愤怒，这样子的时候，其实这个愤怒的种子始终都在我们的心里只不过这个种子呢就是藏得很深就在我们的内心的最深的地方。
So these seeds that exist in our mind contain the latent potential for afflictive emotions. So even when we are extremely happy with no trace of anger or irritation whatsoever, the seeds of anger still exist in our mind. It's only that they are stored in a very, very deep place in the mind, the deepest layer of the mind.
这个种子呢，我们暂时是没有办法控制。
For the time being, the seeds, their existence in our mind is not something that we are able to control.
平时如果我们没有其他的原因的话，其他的条件不具备的情况下虽然有种子但是也不会太多的影响我们的生活。
In the absence of other conditions, the existence of the seeds themselves in our mind doesn't cause too much problems. That is, they don't impact unduly on our lives.
就是不会太多的影响我们的情绪，平时我们都感觉不到有一个这样子的种子的存在。
Or that is to say, they don't have too much influence on our moods. Most of the time, we don't even perceive their existence.
好，然后第二个原因呢，就是我们比如说愤怒的话，这个所愤怒的这个对象对方的这个出现，那么这个出现呢，就是有两种，比如说他人出现在我们的身边或者是人根本就不在身边，但是呢出现在我们的心里都是一样就是对方的这个出现这个就是第二个原因。
The second reason or cause that underpins our anger is the appearance or the emergence of an object of our anger. So this object can arise in two ways. It can arise in reality, say a person arises in our midst or appears in our midst, or otherwise they don't appear actually in our midst but appear in our minds. So this is the second reason or cause, the emergence of an object of anger, for our anger.
然后第三个原因用佛教的话讲，这叫做非理作意非理作意就是非理性的，就是说不符合事实的这样子的观念非理作意就是不正确的这样子的观念或者是想法不正确的想法叫做非理作意。
And then the third cause or reason for is the emergence of conceptual thoughts that don't correspond with reality.
这三个是让我们产生烦恼的主要的原因。
And these three together are the principal causes for the generation of afflictions.
那这三个当中第一个烦恼的种子，我们现在是没有办法把它灭掉。
So of these three different causes, the first one, the existence of seeds of affliction in our mind, this one is something that for the time being we're not able to eliminate.
然后第二个，对方的这个出现出现在我们的身边出现在我们的内心当中这个我们也就不好控制。
And the emergence of objects of our afflictions is also not something we are able to control, whether they appear in reality or in our minds.
然后我们现在我们现在就是一个普普通通的一个这样子的人在这个时候我们完全可以控制的，完全可以改变的完全可以操作的就是我们的这种非理作意就是我们的不正确的想法。
The cause or the reason or the condition that we can control and we absolutely are able to manipulate is, as ordinary persons, the conceptual thought activity that does not correspond with the way that things really are.
那么这个非理作意就是不正确的想法就是有两种一个是完全是我们自己想多了想错了这样子的这个想法根本就不存在的事情，但是我以为是这样子，所以我自己就生气了这种这个想法观念这也叫做非理作意。
So the first kind of incorrect discursive or conceptual thought is where we are mistaken. So whatever it is that we are angry about doesn't really exist, but we think it does, and on this basis we give rise to anger. So this is the first kind of mistaken conceptual activity.
另外一个呢从表面上看就是有道理没有错但是呢如果你这么去想然后我们的心里就是 变得不健康，然后产生很多很多的这个烦恼最后就是我们的心理有可能就是产生心理疾病这样子，所以它有很多很多负面的这个效应，所以呢也叫做非理作意。
The second type of incorrect conceptual thought is in cases where whatever it is that we are feeling angry about, on the surface at least, seems to make sense. However, thinking in this way is unhealthy for us. It breeds a lot of negativity in our minds, and left unchecked could possibly develop into psychological illness. So this kind of thought activity, which generates a lot of negative consequences, is also a kind of mistaken conceptual thought.
比如说有一次有一个人坐公交车，然后这公交车人特别特别的挤。
For example, a person taking a bus, and the bus is extremely crowded.
那挤得根本就没有办法转身。
So crowded that there's not even room to turn around.
这个时候呢就是站在背后有一个人就是手里的东西一直都压住他的背后让他特别的难受。
And if at this time there was a person standing behind oneself who was holding things in their hand and pressing them into one's back, making one feel very uncomfortable.
然后拿什么手里的东西在碰他的背后。
And was pressing something into one's back.
然后他以为是有人故意有人是故意的，或者是流氓。
The person standing in front would think that the person standing behind them was doing this on purpose, or was otherwise being rather perverted.
然后这下子一想到这件事情，然后让他特别的生气。
And in this moment, just thinking about this would make the person standing in front extremely angry.
但是没有办法转身。
However, it wasn't possible for them to turn around.
然后忍了很长时间，在这个过程当中，确实是让他特别难受。
And so they put up with it, they stifled their anger and just put up with it for a very long time, feeling very uncomfortable.
然后最后的时候，这个生气生到确实是没有办法忍的这种地步，然后呢，他想一切办法转身一看。
Until finally the person standing in front was simply not able to contain their anger any longer, and therefore did what they could to turn around.
实际上就是想转身骂人。
So they wanted to turn around and rebuke the person standing behind them.
原来就是一个老太太。
And it turned out when they turned around that the person standing behind them was none other than an old woman.
因为她站不稳她站不稳，所以她就是手里的东西就是一直碰她的背后。
And because the old lady wasn't able to stand stably in the bus, the things that she was holding continually poked the person in front of her.
这下子她看到是一个老太太，然后呢，因为人很多很挤有些时候因为她站不稳手里的东西就碰她的背后，原来又不是流氓，也不是别的人然后这下子她心里的这个气就一下子就消掉了，然后呢，一下子这个愤怒就不见了。
And the person standing in front, when they turned around and discovered that the person behind them was none other than an old lady, and that it was only because she couldn't stand stably in the bus that her things continually poked them, when the person discovered this and realized that it wasn't a perverted person or somebody else, in this very instant their anger dissolved and disappeared completely.
现在我们分析一下这个烦恼是怎么产生的。
So let's take a look at how anger arose in this case.
第一个他的烦恼的种子当然是有关系但不是主要的原因是这个。
Of course, the seeds of affliction are connected to the arising of anger, but they're not the main cause in this situation.
第二个也不是因为这个老太太的出现啊，她后来知道以后一点都不生气。
And neither was the main reason the appearance of the old lady, because as soon as the person discovered it was an old lady, the anger disappeared immediately.
主要的原因是什么呢？就是她自己的费力作意。
So the main reason in this situation for the anger was the mistaken conceptual thought of the person standing in front.
那是不是我们的所有的愤怒都是这样子自己想多了？当然不是。
This doesn't mean, of course, that all of the times that we feel angry is because we have simply been thinking mistakenly about things.
但是如果我们不换一种角度去思考的话那无论是对还是错，无论是有道理没有道理，任何一个事情就可以让我们这么愤怒。不管是有道理没有道理都能够让我们如果自己这么去想错了，就会有可能让我们产生愤怒。
So regardless of whether some kind of incident is correct or incorrect, or whether it makes sense or doesn't make sense, so long as we have a mistaken understanding of it, then it has the capacity to make us angry.
那还有一个更深层次的这个问题，比如说我们的这个意识我们的意识的它的一种盲目的执着，也就让我们经常都发生这样产生这样子的烦恼。
And there's an even deeper issue where the blind stubbornness of our mind causes us to generate afflictions.
比如说我们听到有人说我们的坏话的时候那当然我们非常非常的愤怒了。
Such as when we hear people say insulting things about us, at this time we typically feel extremely angry.
那么为什么愤怒呢？这道理很简单了，就是因为他说我的坏话所以我生气他侮辱我的人格怎么样所以我生气，就是这个原因。
Of course, the reason for our anger in this situation is very straightforward. The reason being that someone said something not nice about us. They insulted our person or whatever, and this is the reason for our anger.
那么他怎么样说你的坏话，怎么样侮辱你的人格呢那我们会说我亲耳听到的呀。
Of course, if we ask how was it that this person insulted your person or said not nice things about you, we would answer, of course, well, I heard it for myself with my own ears.
那么这个时候如果我们不深入的分析的话，那这个看起来就是似乎是很有道理。
And in situations like this, if we, unless we analyze things a little bit more deeply, then this seems very reasonable on the surface.
但是如果我们稍微深入一点分析的话，那这个就是这个，比如说我说他说我的坏话，其实这个话是有问题的。
So we would think that the insulting words that were spoken of us were mistaken.
那首先怎么样说我的坏话？当然就是因为他说出这样子的话我就听到了，所以呢，我认为是他所以他说我的坏话，我就生气。那这个大家都认可了。但是稍微深入的分析的时候，这个所谓的他说我的坏话，还有这个声音他到底是他是不是真的说了话这个我们要深入的思考的时候，就会发现一个很奇怪的现象。
So, of course, we would think that the words were spoken, the sounds of the words were spoken, we heard them, and they insulted us. This is something that everyone would agree about. However, if we look at things more deeply and ask really what did take place at this time, we will discover a very strange phenomenon.
就是说，你听到的这个声音，根本就不是他说的。
And that is that the sound that you heard wasn't spoken by the other person.
那是什么呢？听到的声音就是跟我们的这个听觉有关系。那么听觉，我们的耳朵听到的，实际上根本不是外面的声音外面是没有声音的。这个世界上没有声音，声音这东西呢，这个世界上是不存在的。
Because the sound which was perceived by our hearing faculty doesn't in fact exist in the outside world. There is no externally or independently existing sound.
所以就是说，他从来没有发出过什么声音。
So we can say that the person, our interlocutor, never made any sound.
那我们听到的是什么呢？我们听到的就是自己的这个听觉。
In that case, what was it that we heard? Well, what we heard was our ear consciousness, or the perception of our ear consciousness.
那实际上那我为什么这么听到？他没有说，什么都没有说，我怎么可以听到这样子的声音呢？
Of course, people would ask, if they didn't say anything, then how could it possibly be that I heard something?
然后我们就知道原来这个人说话的这个人的喉咙的声带稍稍的震动了一下。
And by looking at it, we can perceive that what took place in the beginning was that there was a slight vibration of the vocal cords of the other person.
然后这个声带微微的震动了以后呢，然后呢，它的空气就有变化，所以我这个说话的周边的空气当中就产生了一种波就是空气压力波。
And that due to the slight vibration of the vocal cords of the other person, the surrounding air was affected, creating a sound wave, and this indeed is what we perceived.
然后这个空气压力波就像水波一样，最后就是这个空气的波就传到我们的耳朵里面。
This sound wave, just like a wave in the water, finally reached our ear.
然后这个波就是稍稍的震动了一下我们的耳膜。
And this wave, when it reached our ear, stimulated our ear membrane.
那实际上真正发生的事情就是仅此而已。
So in actual fact, all that took place in this whole exchange was just these few things.
没有发生任何别的事情。
In addition to these, nothing else took place.
如果你这个时候没有这种胡思乱想、这个非理作意的话，那顶多就动了一下你的耳膜而已。
So in this situation, unless one does a lot of mistaken conceptual thinking, then what took place is little more than a bit of stimulation of one's ear membrane.
但是我们这个时候就开始在这个上面然后就增加了很多很多的东西以后，然后这个事情就是有本质上的不一样了。
However, what takes place is that on top of what took place, we elaborate a great deal more, such that the essence of what takes place changes significantly.
实际上，我们现在我们说话，大家听到的这个声音也是一样，也不是别人的声音，就是自己的这个感受用佛教的话，佛教就是很早以前2000多年前就在讲这个事情。最近科学家也发现了，没有声音了所谓的声音就是自己的大脑当中 产生的一种画面而已，实际上就是自己的大脑里面的声音啊，根本就不是那个人发出来的声音，那个人什么都没有发出来。
So it's the same with all the voices and all the sounds that we hear. These voices and sounds are none other than the experience of our own hearing sensory faculty. This is something that was discovered 2,500 years ago by the Buddha. More recently, science has also discovered this truth. In this situation, there is no, the other person, the interlocutor, is not making any sound. They didn't say anything. Rather, what is experienced is an image or a perception in one's own brain.
然后我们比如说密法密宗里面就有一个叫做六根自解脱六根就是我们的眼耳鼻舌身，然后就是我们的意识，这六个叫做六根自解脱，就是自己得到解脱。
In the Vajrayana tradition, there is liberation through the six senses. And this liberation through the six senses here refer to our five sensory faculties, our eye consciousness, ear consciousness, and so forth, as well as our mental consciousness. And self-liberation in this context means that these consciousnesses liberate themselves.
那么六根自解脱当中的这个耳根我们这个六根当中的耳根自解脱是什么？就是这个空气压力波就使它的耳根震动，不断的在震动，但是呢，这就是物理上的一个这个空气压力波就是让它的耳根震动了，但是它内心根本就不震动它内心根本就不震动，不动摇不影响。所以这个声音给它不起任何的这个负面的作用所以它的这个内心是不会受到任何的影响，所以叫做解脱自解脱这叫做耳根自解脱。
When we talk about the self-liberation of the ear consciousness, this is a situation where a practitioner hears, say, a sound wave, and it stimulates the different components of their ear. However, there is no impact on the mind. There is no movement that takes place or no influence that takes place in the mind as a result. So that means that there is no negativity that is arisen in the mind upon hearing this sound. So this is what we refer to by self-liberation of the ear consciousness.
这个有一种训练的方法，训练的方法呢自己坐在一个很大的这个镜子坐在这个镜子前面，然后呢把自己照出来然后呢面对面的坐在镜子前面실고
So there's a way that we can train ourselves in this method. We need to seat ourselves in front of a big mirror and look at ourselves.
坐在这个镜子前面，然后呢就是这个把自己呢当作另外一个人这个镜子里面的这个形象，就是当作原来的我，然后我开始批评他。
And what one can do in this situation is to imagine the person in the mirror as another person and oneself as oneself, and then to 谁批评谁啊？
然后自己的一些生活的细节别人不知道的我们自己都非常清楚了这样子以后呢，首先就讲一些比较表面的不太伤害的这样子的事情然后就是把这些都点出来。
And one starts off with this critique of the image in the mirror with details of their life that one knows in great detail, but one starts off with superficial kinds of things that won't cause too much injury or harm, and begins to point these out.
然后呢就是进一步的加深就一些比较触碰到一些比较关键问题的事情 拿出来讲你这个人格的不对，然后呢哪里为人处事，什么时候犯过什么样的错误全部指出来。这个时候我们人在一个就是周围根本没有人的一个这样子的房间，这个根本不可能任何人听得到然后这个我们非常清楚，这个镜子里面的形象不是另外一个人，其实就是我的心想而已但是这个时候呢，我们就是有点不高兴就是自己说出自己的这些缺陷这样子的时候，批评的时候，然后就是因为尤其是触碰到一些比较关键问题的时候呢，然后自己心里就不高兴，特别不高兴。
So we can progress from relatively mild criticisms to ones that are more deeper and hit more sensitive points and touch on more critical things. For example, problems with our personality, the way that we treat others, or mistakes that we've done in the past. In this kind of practice, we're in a big room where no one else is around, no one else can hear us. And even though we are aware that the person that we see in the mirror is none other than our own reflection, because they are saying to us making such serious criticisms and pointing out our inadequacies, we typically feel very, very unhappy.
然后首先就是自我训练。自我训练的时候呢，最好的时候稍微时间长一点的时候呢这个时候确实是自己的这个声音只震动自己的耳膜但是不震动不动摇我们的心心就可以如如不动再说什么更大的更重要的更要害的这些问题指出来了但是也就可以保持一个非常平静的状态。
So we start off by training ourselves in this way. Eventually, through with some length of time, we'll be able to train ourselves so that when we hear things, we only experience them as some kind of stimulation of our ear, and our minds will be able to remain calm and without sustaining any kind of injury or offense.
然后有了这个训练以后呢，然后我们可以在生活当中就是故意的去听一些这个时候就不是自己说这个时候是真正别人说那么别人说的时候呢，也去听一听别人对我的这些批评然后呢就做这个训练，这个就是我们平时讲的这个生活当中的修行训练。
And after we have trained ourselves in this way by working with the mirror, then we can move on to actually training in real life. And we can do this by deliberately seeking out situations or exposing ourselves to situations where other people are criticizing us. And when we do this, when we listen to the criticisms that are being made, then this is a way of doing practice in real life.
最后真的是达到了这个六根自解脱这样子的类似于这样子的这个境界就是听到了平时非常非常不喜欢听到的这样子的批评但是心可以很淡定。
And it's possible by training in this way to reach a level that is approximate to the self-liberation of the six senses, where one can hear criticisms that are being made without losing calmness in one's mind. That is, one's mind remains perfectly calm throughout.
好，然后另外一个思维的方式另外一个思维的方式呢，比如说平时有人说你长得很丑这样子的时候呢，我们一定会很不高兴的。
So there's another approach to thinking that we can take. So let's say, for example, usually if someone were to say to us, "You look very ugly," we would feel very unhappy.
那么这个时候我们不高兴，不高兴的是他说的长得很丑，当然是这个肉体了啊，他不是说你的意识长得很丑，你的心长得精神长得很丑。
And of course, in this situation, the person saying that we look ugly is not saying that our mind looks ugly or our consciousness looks ugly.
但是我们的身体呢，它永远都不会生气的，它是无所谓的啊，赞扬啊，他也不会高兴啊，然后呢，有人批评啊，他也不会生气。
Our physical bodies, however, don't give rise to unhappiness or won't give rise to unhappiness, regardless of whatever someone says about them. Then our physical bodies, it's themselves don't get angry.
然后生气的这个呢，就是我们的意识啊。那么任何人都看不到我的意识长什么样子，所以呢，从来都没有人说他长得不好看。
However, in this case, what is feeling angry is our mind, is our consciousness. However, no one has ever been able to see our consciousness or see our mind and be able to say what it looks like. So therefore, then in no position to say whether it's good looking or not.
那么从来都没有人说他长得丑，那这样子呢，关他什么事呢？我们也要去深入的去思考。
So in this situation, in fact, what was being criticized was the physical appearance of the person. It wasn't the mind or the consciousness that was being criticized, and therefore the mind has got no reason to feel angry that the body was being criticized.
所以在这些问题里面，就是有一个很多的模糊的地方。
So in these situations, it's very blurry or unclear.
然后这个模糊的部分我们把它分解一看的时候呢，原来很多都是刚才我们讲的非理作意原来我们比如说有人说我的坏话这个不是我以为他说我的坏话，实实在在是说了的我亲耳听到了。这个时候我不高兴，那么我们从表面上看，这个不是非理作意，这个就是正常的。但是这么一分析，深入一分析的时候，原来声音就是我自己的感受，没有他，这声音不是他发出来的这样子以后呢，我以为这个声音就是他就从他嘴里传出来的所以我现在就是不高兴。那么这个也是错误，实际上他没有传出什么声音，这也是非理作意。
So by looking more deeply into these blurry or unclear aspects of these kinds of encounters, we can see that things that appeared on the surface to be insulting. For example, in the case of someone speaking insulting words, it's true that this is not something that we imagine. Somebody actually did utter these words, and at least on the surface this appears not to be mistaken. However, when we analyze it more deeply, we can recognize that in fact hearing insulting words was only a perception or an experience, and that in actual fact these words were never uttered from the mouth of the other person. And so we can see that these are all examples where our unpleasant experience arises from mistaken conceptual thinking.
然后就是有人说我的肉体长得不怎么样，这样子的时候，我的精神就开始生气了。那么这两个到底是什么关系？从来都没有说我的意识的问题，说的是肉体的问题但是呢，肉体它就反而不生气精神就生气了。那么这两个之间的关系是什么？
And then in the second case, when someone insults our physical appearance, saying that we're not particularly good looking, in this situation our mind gets angry. But again, this is a situation of our mind getting angry when it was our physical body that was criticized. Why isn't our physical body getting angry in this situation? So this is the relationship.
从我们平常的这个层面，就是我们从现实的这个角度去看的话，这个都是似乎是没有什么问题这样子。但是呢，深入了解的时候呢，其实这里面也有问题。 所以也是不符合事实啊，所以也叫做非理作义。
In both of these situations, from a conventional perspective, we might say that there's nothing abnormal with the way that we think and react. However, when we probe things more deeply, we can discover that in fact there are problems with our thinking, our way of thinking, and that these are instances of mistaken conceptual thinking.
这个思维的方式，我们平时没有学佛的人，比如说刚刚进入佛门，或者是第一次听到这样子的内容的时候呢，可能是有一点点不太好理解。
It might be the case that this mode of thinking is for people who are new to Buddhism or who have only heard these kinds of teachings for the first time, that it's a little bit difficult to understand.
甚至就是这种说法就是有一点点抵触。
Some people might even reject these kinds of ideas.
但是都没关系的，这个是有一种过程，我们要逐步的去探索。这样子以后，最后就是明白的原来我们的这些生气烦恼就是深入思考的时候，确实是是没有任何道理的但是呢，我们把一个这样子没有道理的东西到了我们的这个感官的层面的时候呢，它就变得有道理了。
But this is no problem. Arriving at an understanding of these things is something that we can do gradually through a process of exploration. Eventually, we will be able to understand that, in fact, there is no reason for our anger and affliction. Despite there being no reason, however, when we experience these things at the level of our sensory faculties, it seems as if there is a reason for our anger.
好，这样子，我们当我们就是听到了一些某些人说了我的坏话这样子就是因为这个原因生气的时候首先静下来，然后去思考一下这个声音是什么他所谓的说我坏话是什么这样思考以后呢，然后就是明白了这些道理的时候呢原来这些全部的这些东西都建立在一个自己的错觉或者是错误的理解的基础上一定会明白这个道理了以后呢我们的这个愤怒一定会下降。
So next time we hear somebody say something insulting about us that causes us to feel angry, what we should do is calm ourselves down and contemplate what it was that we actually heard. What was the sound that we heard? What was the insult that we heard? And when we gradually come to an understanding of this principle, we will recognize that all of our anger, in fact, is established on a foundation of mistaken understanding or mistaken perception. And when we understand this, then our anger will reduce at once.
还有一个我们刚才讲的这个把一个镜子大一点的镜子放在前面然后呢，我们就是在这个镜子里面看出来的面对我自己的形象然后就是说一些他的坏话，然后看我的心动不动了，这种训练也是非常有意义的也是一个在这个过程当中我们也会发现一些非常奇怪的事情比如说一周就一次然后呢一次就10分钟15分钟这么一个短的时间做一个训练这也是一个非常好的方法。
And the other method that we mentioned of sitting oneself in front of a large mirror and facing one's own reflection and saying critical things and observing what the reaction in one's mind is. This is a very meaningful and useful form of practice, and by doing it we can discover strange results that even within a very short period of time of doing this kind of training, even as little as 10 to 15 minutes once a week, that we will begin to see good results.
好，这样做一个训练的话，那时间不需要太长的时间啊。最后呢，我们就深深的体会到啊，原来别人说我的坏话，也就是这样子啊，没有什么大不了的事情啊。这样就是这种心态啊。然后呢，我们就在现实生活当中，真的有一天听到了特别不愿意听到的这样子的事情的时候呢，之前没有做过训练和现在完全是有一个很大的不一样，巨大的变化。
We don't need to do this practice for a particularly long period of time. Even within a short period of time, we can gain really deep experience that insulting words are not much other than this, and that they are no big deal. And we will be able to cultivate this kind of attitude. And when we bring this into our everyday life, if one day we hear words spoken about us that really are truly insulting, that we would never wish to hear, through this training we will discover that our response, after having done some training compared to that of when we had done no training, is there's a big difference.
好，这个我们刚才讲的3个这个让我们生气的这个原因当中，这个我们刚刚讲的这个威力的作意，这个是我们随时都可以改变，这个观念是可以改变。这个观念一改变了以后呢，然后我们的脾气就是不会那么的这个暴躁很多人现在因为工作压力，各种各样的压力在这种压力下每一个人就是逐渐就变得这个脾气非常的暴躁非常浮躁就没办法控制。所以呢，我们就是安排抽一点时间做一个这样子的训练一定会有收获的。
Of the 3 reasons or causes that we mentioned earlier that lead to anger or afflictions, the third one, mistaken conceptual thinking, is one that we can intervene in any time, that we can change at any time. And through changing our conceptual thinking, it is possible to make our usual temper less explosive. Most people have very explosive tempers that come about through pressure in everyday life, pressure in work, and sometimes evolve to an uncontrollable state. If we can take some time, however, to do the training that we mentioned before, then we will surely see changes in this regard.
好，那这些道理或者这些方法这样子做对不对对不对呢其实这个里面我们上午也讲过了，其实这里面没有什么对和不对只要我们不生气就对了。
So in respect of these principles and methods that we've just been talking about, well, one might ask, are they true or not? Are they correct or not? And as we mentioned earlier this morning, there is no ultimately correct or incorrect. And so long as these methods can assist us not to get angry, then that's fine.
实际上这些思维呢，就是深入的思维的时候，其实也是对的有道理的。实际上这个我们的很多的深层次的地方都是这样，但是呢这些深层次比如说像物质也是这样，这个物质的结构，比如说一瓶水，我们用显微镜看，那它的结构根本就不是我们现实生活当中看到的一样。但是它虽然它的本质不是这样子，但是它在我们的这个感官的前面它就是这样子 所以我们的生活这个物质世界就变成这样子。所以我们很多时候我们认为是很正常的，是对的应该是这样子的等等深入的思考的时候都不是这样。
In actual fact, the modes of analysis or ways of thinking that we've been talking about do make sense. In many cases, it's the case that when we analyze things deeper, that they are really different than the way that we take them to be on the surface. It's the same with physical matter as well. Just taking this bottle, if we were to look at it under a high-powered microscope, then it would appear very different to the way that it appears to our naked eye. And so this is also the case with many other ways that we think in life, many things that we take to be normal and correct and self-evident. When we look at them more deeply, we find that in fact this isn't the case.
这三个原因当中，这个第二个就是堆放我们平时呢，我们生气的时候，就是往往就是最狠的最生气的就是对方这个人。
So of the three reasons or causes that we mentioned before, the second is the object of our anger. Frequently, when we get angry, that which we feel the greatest anger and hatred towards is the object, the person.
比如说人用石头用木棍用什么东西打我们的时候让我们的身上直接让我们的身上产生疼痛的这种感觉，也就是说让我们特别难受痛苦的，实际上就是这些石头木棍等等这些东西。但是呢，我们从来都不会对石头和对其他东西生气。
Let's say, for example, that someone beats us with a wooden stick or stones that cause our body to become injured or cause our body to give rise to a feeling of pain. In factual fact, what has caused our feeling of pain is the stick or the stones. But we never feel angry towards the sticks and the stones. We always feel angry towards the person.
那我们为什么对这个石头砖头不生气呢？我们就会觉得因为这个石头砖头是别人往我身上扔不是因为这个，就是因为别人用这个东西来打我，实际上不是他的本意是别人往我身上扔所以呢这个石头或者这些其他东西我没有必要生他的气，实际上就是这个是因为这个人搞的，所以我要喊他。我们的道理是这样子。
And of course, the reason that we think like this is because we would think that there's no reason for us to be angry at the rocks or the stones. They were thrown at us by someone else. It was that other person who threw them at us that caused us to be injured. So this is our conventional way of thinking.
如果以这个道理以此类推。这样子的话，那么人也是一样的人也不是故意的，因为人他平时也，比如说以前是我的一个非常好的朋友，那这样子，后来他伤害我、打我这样子的话，那他对我很好的时候，哪个阶段他是这样子吗？他不是这样子那后来他为什么变成这样子呢？这不是因为他人的问题，就是因为就是主要的原因，就是他的人的精神的一部分就是烦恼因为烦恼人也就是失去自由了所以这个主要的原因还不是人就是烦恼。
But if we continue to infer in this manner, then we can say that not only were the rocks and stones not deliberate in inflicting pain, but neither was the person themselves, the person who threw them. Let's just say this person once upon a time was our good friend and then subsequently did these actions that harmed us. We might ask, what was it that caused them to change? And in asking this question, we can answer that it wasn't the person itself that changed, but rather their mind, and only a part of their mind. That is, it was due to afflictions that caused them to lose control and do what they did.
这种推理听起来就是有点荒唐其实不是真正荒唐的，就是我们自己的这种想法确实是很荒唐的。其实这个道理完全是这样子如果我们认为，因为这个砖头是别人扔到我的身上不是他自己飞来的，所以我不生他的气，没有必要生他气。那么这样子的话，那么人的手人为什么这样子动手人为什么向我动手？也不是他那是什么呢？谁让他这么做呢？那是他的烦恼，他的愤怒所以我们最终得到的结论我们的真正的敌人就不是这个人，而是这个人的烦恼，而是这个人的愤怒，愤怒才是我们的敌人，人不是我们的敌人。
Even though it might seem that this mode of thinking is a bit absurd or ridiculous, actually it isn't absurd or ridiculous. What is absurd or ridiculous is our own way of thinking. If we say that we are not angry at the rocks or stones because they didn't, they weren't the ones, that it was the person who threw them, not the stones themselves, then we should apply that same logic and ask what caused the person to do this. And if we ask this question, we can see very clearly that it was actually their afflictions that caused them to throw the phone. So we finally or eventually then can recognize that our enemy is not the person, but rather their afflictions, that our ultimate enemy is anger and afflictions.
那么这个消灭敌人佛教的方法，他认为他的敌人就是对方的愤怒，而不是对方，所以呢，他就想办法消灭他心里的愤怒这是佛教消灭敌人的方法。
In Buddhism, when we speak of destroying one's enemy, we don't mean destroying the person, but rather the anger in their mind. So when this is the enemy in Buddhism, is not the person, but rather the affliction or anger.
然后我们世俗的人消灭敌人的方法，他不认为他的敌人是这个人的愤怒，他认为他的敌人就是这个人所以他就要消灭这个人，而不是消灭他的烦恼。
However, for ordinary worldly people, destroying enemies means destroying the person, not destroying the anger or the affliction.
然后因为这样子的观点就是发生了人类历史上发生了各种各样的战争结束了吗？还没有结束将来还出现什么样的这个战争，谁都说不清楚。还有一个更重要的问题，更严重的问题呢，比如说这一世然后你即使是消灭了你的敌人，但是呢，就是结上了更严重的恶缘。那这个恶缘就是在这个轮回当中是没完没了的就是几千万年、几百万年当中就是相互打打杀杀，没完没了。那结果就是这样子。
And it's due to this reason that throughout the course of human history, we have had as many wars as we have had. Are these wars yet finished? No, they're not. They're still going on, and how many will take place in the future, no one can say for sure. But amidst this is an even more serious problem, and that is that even if in this life we manage to destroy our enemy, in doing so we will be sowing the seed of even more serious negative karma that will then result in negative outcomes in endless lifetimes in the future. So this is what causes an endless negative or vicious cycle.
然后世俗的人世俗的人就是战争然后打败了对方的比如说国王、大臣或者是军队这样子以后呢，那么他的老百姓那么就是变成了他的了，那就不需要去消灭。那人类历史上古代都是这样子。
For worldly people or for ordinary people in the course of wars, after a king or ministers or armies were conquered, then the ordinary people were taken by the other side. In ancient times, this is what happened.
然后佛教我就把对方的这个愤怒打败打败了消灭了以后呢，人就可以变成我的很好的朋友我就不消灭这个人，我就消灭他的愤怒。这就是佛教的这个消灭敌人的方法。最后呢，人就可以成为他的很好的朋友了。
The Buddhist approach to conquering enemies, on the other hand, is one of eliminating the anger or the affliction in the enemy and not the other person. By taking this approach, it is possible that one's enemy can actually become one's friend. So this is the Buddhist approach to destroying enemies.
然后我们发现有人对我不满或者是对我愤怒这样子的时候呢，那我们想办法消除他的内在的愤怒这样子以后呢，当他的愤怒没有了以后呢然后他就可以变成我的非常好的朋友，完全是有可能的所以呢，佛法它的所有的方法都不对人就是对烦恼像文殊菩萨像文殊菩萨的手里有一个宝剑大家都看到了宝剑。还有我们比如说很多的佛像的这个手里就是有一些武器，古代的武器，枪刀有，但是这些宝剑这些枪这些弓箭不对任何人对什么呢？不针对任何一个人，任何一条生命针对什么呢？针对众生心里的烦恼他要杀掉的，他要消灭的就是这些烦恼，而不是这些生命。
What we can discover thereby is that by eliminating the anger or affliction in the minds of our enemy, that it is entirely possible that our enemies can become our friends. So in Buddhism, the methods, Buddhism's methods for conquering the enemy or destroying the enemy are not oriented at the person, but rather to their afflictions. So everybody knows the Bodhisattva Manjushri, who wields a sword of wisdom. And indeed, many Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are depicted with different weapons, such as knives and swords. In all of these cases, the weapons they are holding are not directed at other beings, but rather at the afflictions in the minds of other beings. And it is these that the weapons are geared to eliminating, and not the beings themselves.
然后世俗的人他消灭敌人的工具就是各种各样的武器。
Of course, the weapons that ordinary people use for destroying their enemies include all of the various kinds of weapons that we have.
然后佛教消灭敌人的工具是什么？就是慈悲心。
But the main weapon that Buddhism has for destroying the enemy is bodhicitta.
比如说有人对你特别不好的时候，你反而对他这个发出慈悲心，这个看起来从世俗的眼光看特别显得软弱这样子但是实际上这种方法就可以解决这个仇恨的根源。
when one is treated badly by another person, to respond to them with compassion from a worldly or ordinary perspective looks like a very weak thing to do. But in actual fact, this approach is able to resolve anger at its very root.
比如说某一个人对我特别不好的时候其实我们是做不到。假使我们能够做得到的话，那我反而对他更好一点这样子的话，那么他的这个内心当中的愤怒就是因为我的慈悲心就感化了他的这个就是愤怒然后没有这个愤怒了以后呢，然后人对我没有什么不好我们可以做很好的朋友这样子从此以后呢就完全就结束了这个仇恨的恶缘。
So in a situation when someone treats us very badly, if we are not able to respond in this way, I guess we can't respond in this way, but if we can, what we should do is treat them even better when they treat us badly. And by responding to their anger with compassion in this way, it is possible for us to dissolve their anger and for us to be able to be friends.
当年释迦牟尼佛成佛的时候我们这个故事大家都应该是听说过了佛陀成佛的时候，然后就是很多的魔王他不高兴，然后呢带领他的魔军来这个阻碍佛陀的这个成佛，然后呢这个就是人，比如说像刀枪剑各种各样当时的这个最厉害的这些武器就往佛陀身上扔。
Everybody is probably familiar with the story of the Shakyamuni Buddha when he was about to achieve Buddhahood. At this point, the king of the Maras was very unhappy and so dispatched his army of Maras to prevent or to hinder his realization. And they hurled various kinds of weapons at the Buddha, including knives and swords and all the most advanced weapons of the day.
然后这些武器在魔军的手里，这是武器然后扔到佛陀的身上，到了佛陀的身上然后都变成了闲话。
But all of these weapons, when they were in the hands of the Mara army, were in the form of weapons. However, when these weapons landed on the body of the Buddha, they were transformed into flowers.
那么佛陀这个成佛的时候，是不是真实出现过一个这样子的历史呢？这么一段历史呢？也不一定这就是一种象征。它象征什么？它说明什么呢？比如说别人对你不好的，比如说再凶恶的，像魔军，我们在传说当中是最凶、最厉害的这样子。那么他的最厉害的这些武器。如果你以慈悲心去这个面对这样子的话，那么都会变成闲话。闲话就是说这些东西呢不会伤害你而变成了大家都最喜欢的闲话，变成了闲话这个就是里面呢有一个这样子的意思。所以我们现在还没有成佛，但是呢这个我们可以在生活当中可以去用可以落实它的内容。
Is it the case that this story, or what was described in this story, really took place when the Buddha achieved enlightenment? Well, this is not necessarily the case, but this story does serve to symbolize something for us. And that is when others are treating us extremely badly, say, as in this case, using the most brutal weapons that existed, if we respond with compassion, then these brutal weapons can be transformed into flowers. That is to say, these weapons will be of no harm to us and will also transform as flowers, something that we like very much. Even though we have not yet arrived at the point of Buddhahood, this is a method that we too can put into place in our everyday lives.
但是我们真正遇到这样子的问题的时候呢，别人对我们特别不好的时候我们反而就是更加的慈悲。这个是我们话可以这么说，理论上是这样子，但是呢，我们没有人能够做得到那怎么办我们很多时候很多人也讲这个道理我明白但是我做不到，很多人都这么讲我们当然做不到。为什么做不到呢？就是因为我们没有去训练所以我们做不到，只是懂道理而已。
So this approach of when people are treating us badly to respond to them with compassion, the problem is that in practice no one really can do it. Many people say, well, I understand this in theory, but unfortunately I just can't do it in practice. And the reason for this is that we typically don't train ourselves in this method. If we simply understand the method intellectually but don't train ourselves in it, then of course we won't be able to implement it.
那么我们到底这个我们作为一个普通人能不能做能不能做到如果我们的人的能力永远都达不到这个标准的话，那我们讲这个道理也是没有用的没有用的。那我们到底能不能做得到呢？当然是可以的。前提的条件呢，当我们还没有遇到这样子的情况的时候平时每天都做一点点训练，也就是用我们佛教的话说，每天都有一段时间就用来打坐修慈悲心。那这样子的话，到时候我们需要的时候，随时都可以用得上。
So ultimately, is this a method that we as ordinary people can put into practice? If it is not something that ordinary people have the capacity of doing, then there really isn't any point in us talking about it. So we ask the question, is this possible that an ordinary person could achieve this, could be able to practice this method? And the answer is yes, absolutely, it is possible. However, the precondition is that prior to encountering such instances, it's important that we do some training every day, and that we do this training in the form of meditation by cultivating compassion.
然后我们平时也多也去思考比如说别人用非常恶毒的这样子的语言来攻击这样子的时候呢，然后也就他也是因为烦恼我们大家都有烦恼这个烦恼一起来了以后呢任何人都管不住自己的嘴管不住自己的手，我们大家都是一样这个时候呢，就是反而就对他就产生同情和这个慈悲这样子是最好的消除自己的愤怒的方法。但是我们刚才也讲了，要做到这一点，那平时我们要做一点训练。
So we should accustom ourselves to thinking or contemplating that when we find ourselves in a situation where people are using extremely poisonous language to attack us, that the reason they do that, in fact, it is their afflictions that are causing this. It's the arising of their afflictions that have led to them not to be able to control their mouth or control their actions. And this is something that everybody experiences in this situation. So by thinking in this way, it's possible for us to give rise to empathy for others. And indeed, this is the best way of eliminating our anger. However, as mentioned before, this is something that we beforehand need to train ourselves in.
这个时候我们以一个能够理解对方的这个心态来看怎么样理解呢？就是因为这个烦恼一产生了以后呢 任何一个人都是一样，就控制不住自己。比如说，我们每一年都全世界有100万人去自杀啊，难道他们不珍惜自己的生命吗？当然不是啊，每一个人啊，每一个包括一个动物、蚂蚁啊、蚯蚓啊，都是一样，就是大家都认为自己的生命才是最珍贵。但是啊，烦恼一起来了以后呢，啊。就是把自己的生命都会毫无犹豫的毁掉。那烦恼就是有这么厉害啊！这个100万人呢，每年100万，这100万人他没有烦恼的时候呢，他会这样子吗？根本就不可能的。但是呢，因为烦恼这个东西已进入了我们的意识然后就是人就完全就失控了。这我们刚才讲了电脑的病毒。电脑病毒，电脑就变成乱七八糟，不是电脑的问题，是病毒的问题。我们现在所有的措施所有的方法，不要针对电脑不要把电脑炸掉就是把解决这个病毒就可以了就是这样子的道理。我们世俗人的做法呢，因为这个电脑它现在不听话了，我要把它炸掉这是世俗的人的消灭敌人的方法。弟子们送啊。
Mujok. Then, so by coming to understand, or by gaining an understanding that it is the arising of afflictions in the minds of others that lead them not to be able to control themselves, we will be able to appreciate that, say, in the situation of suicide, 1 million people commit suicide each year. This is not due to the fact that these people don't cherish their lives. Every single being, whether from a small ant or a fly, regards their lives as the most precious and treasured thing. So would it be, if were it not for affliction, then none of these people would wish to destroy their lives. However, this is the power that affliction has, such that when it arises, people are even willing to destroy their own lives without the least hesitation whatsoever. So this kind of loss of control that we speak about now is like when a virus infects a computer and turns it into a state of chaos. This takes place not because of the computer, but because of the virus. So because of this, our response should be not to destroy the computer, but to remove the virus inside it. Of course, the approach of an ordinary person or a worldly person is to discover that the computer is not working and to destroy the computer. And indeed, this is the worldly or ordinary approach to destroying enemies.
如果电脑的程序有了病毒，然后我们把电脑炸掉就是因为理由就是因为它不工作了，它不听话，它不听我的命令，所以我要把它炸掉。那么这种行为大家都认为是非常的荒唐但是如果换过来比如说有一个人的意识当中，他平时不是这样子，但是呢有一个人的意识当中进入了烦恼就是进入了这个愤怒这个病毒，然后呢他就对着我干，那这个时候呢有人去把这个人消灭了，那么我们世俗的人就不觉得这个荒唐。其实这两个道理是一模一样的，完全是一样那为什么道理都是一样呢？那我们为什么还觉得这个不荒唐？一个是很荒唐的行为，另外一个是非常合理，为什么这样子呢？这不就说了吗？我们刚才我们的这种思维的方式就是不懂得换角度去思考就这么一个非常死板的思维的方式去思考，所以觉得这个是有道理的。
Of course, if a computer were to be infected by a virus and then begin not to work very well, then to take the action of destroying the computer would be seen by everyone as a very ridiculous course of action. However, If, on the other hand, if we take the example of a person, let's just say that the mind of a person is ordinarily okay. However, due to the arising of affliction, the arising of anger, they do particular things. Then to destroy the person is something that many people would see as not ridiculous. But in actual fact, in both cases, whether it be the computer that is infected by the virus or the person who is taken over by an affliction, both follow the same principle. Why is it that we see one as ridiculous and the other as reasonable? Well, the reason is that, just as we talked about earlier, that we are not accustomed to knowing how to change perspectives, change the perspectives through which we view a particular situation. We're accustomed to looking at things through the same old rigid perspective.
好，这个时候我们还要去思考一下，那么谁让他产生了这么严重的这个愤怒把自己的生命都可以毁掉，把别人也可以毁掉，把自己的未来都毁掉的这样子的烦恼谁让他产生这样子的烦恼呢？这个时候我们很多时候都从来都不考虑我自己有没有这个责任从来都不考虑，我们认为这是他不对他不应该怎么。但这个时候，如果我们设身处地的去思考一下，也许让他这么烦恼，跟我有很大的关系如果是这样子的话，那真正的受害者不是我，而是他因为我让他产生了这么严重的烦恼，然后呢，因为他有这样子的烦恼的时候，他就失控了然后呢，他没办法，他关不住自己的嘴，关不住自己的手就导致了这样子的这个结果。然后呢，这个结果一定会影响到他的各个方面，他的生活、工作各方面所以他是受害者所以呢，这个时候呢我们更加的觉得就不应该不应该去恨不应该去愤怒别人实际上让他这么产生这么大烦恼，跟我有关系，是我不对那这个也是一个非常好的一个消除愤怒的一个方法。
Another approach or way of thinking that we can adopt is to inquire who it was or what it was that made this other person give rise to such serious anger, such that they would destroy themselves or destroy others and destroy their own future through the actions that they take on the basis of that anger. And we should ask the question, do I personally have some responsibility in this? Typically, this is never something that we ask of ourselves. We're always accustomed to blaming the other person. However, if we really search deep inside ourselves, it's possible that we might discover that the affliction, the anger in the mind of the other person actually has a significant connection with ourselves. And if this is the case, then in actual fact, the victim is not ourselves, but the other person. Through giving rise to affliction, losing control, not being able to control their speech and their actions, they did things with particular results which will have negative impacts on their life for in the future. So we can see in this situation that the victim in this situation is the other person. And by thinking like this, we can see that there's no justification for feeling anger towards others or hatred to others. And by recognizing one's own fault or implication in the arising of anger of another person, this is a really effective method for eliminating our own anger.
今天我们给大家介绍的这些消除自己的烦恼的这些方法我们随时都可以用而且我们每一个人都能够用得上的一些这样子的方法。
So the methods that we have introduced this afternoon for eliminating one's anger are ones that everyone can use anytime and any place, and they're also methods that are relatively easily able to be implemented.
然后我们平时我们生活当中呢，就是有些时候，就是因为各种各样的原因就生一点点的气这个很难免也用不上这么多的方法但是呢，有些时候确实是比较深一点的这个仇恨先是生气然后这个持续的连续的。这个部分叫做仇恨那开始的这个念头就是生气、愤怒的延续就是仇恨。那么这样子的这个仇恨和愤怒是确实是对自己也有很大的伤害，对别人也有非常不利的。所以呢，这种仇恨、这种愤怒我们要想各种各样的方法来让它结束那我们今天下午这个讲的有几个比较具体的这个方法都是我们都是用得上的然后呢，大家进一步的去再具体一点的去学一学然后呢，我们到时候遇到问题的时候去用看看有没有效果这样我们就知道这些方法的它的实用的价值。
So it's unavoidable that in the course of our lives, due to various small reasons, we'll give rise to a bit of anger. And in such cases, it might not be necessary that we put into place these methods that we have talked about today. However, in cases of serious anger, we talk about the initial arising or arousing of anger as anger, and then the continuation of this state as one of hatred. If we give rise to a state like this, then this is actually one that can be very harmful, not only to ourselves, but also to others. And so this kind of anger is something that we need to find a method to eliminate. What we talked about this afternoon are concrete methods that everyone can put into practice. And by studying them and training oneself in them a bit further, you can see for yourself whether or not they bring about results. And by doing this, everyone will surely recognize the use value of these methods.
比如说我们平时这个工作上有很多的竞争那么这个正常的这样子的这个竞争的过程当中也会产生很多的生气烦恼这样子但是愤怒烦恼对我们的工作是没有任何的用处所以我们想一切办法把这个愤怒和烦恼解决但是呢竞争还是要继续要竞争但是在这个过程当中我们不要用不合理的手段就这样的意思这个并不是说我们修菩提心全部让给别人我什么都不要这个可能恐怕现在还不是时候
Yes, in the course of our professional lives, there is a great deal of competition, and quite often this competition results in anger and affliction, and anger and affliction are of no benefit to us whatsoever, so we need to find a way of resolving the anger and affliction. Competition, however, is something that we need to keep engaging in for the present time being. It's not as if because we are cultivating bodhicitta, therefore every single thing we need to allow to the other side, or at least for the time being, we're probably not yet at this level.
好，最后给大家推荐这个一本书这个书就叫做《入菩萨心论》。应该是大多数的人知道的这里面这些方法是非常非常丰富的希望大家好好的学了以后去用。
Finally, I'd just like to recommend a text to everybody. This is The Way of a Bodhisattva. Everybody is no doubt familiar with this book or this text. Contained within it are a rich array of methods for dealing with affliction. I urge everyone to learn about these methods and to put them into practice.
好，谢谢大家。我们现在最后做一个回向。回向的意思呢，我们上午就已经讲过了。我们现在把我们的功德分享给天下所有的众生，愿我们的功德能让天下所有的众生幸福快乐，最后大家都能够了脱生死苦海发这样子的愿，然后就念这个回向的字。
So we're going to end now with a dedication. We talked this morning about what it means to dedicate merit. So now we will end with a prayer of dedication that all beings enjoy happiness and health and ultimately liberation from the ocean of samsara.
Sonam de da je zamba nya to ne ni be da na ban she Tir ga nan je wang long zhe ba zhe bin zo lian zhou a zhou wer shu Om a hong ban zhen ge de ba ma se de hong Om a hong ban zhen ge de ba ma se de hong Om a hong ban zhen ge de ba ma se de hong
谢谢大家，阿弥陀佛，扎西德勒。